quiet archive story, the Bob Lazar story. In the late 20th century, a quiet and technically minded man stepped forward with a claim so extraordinary that it would permanently alter how the public spoke about secrecy, science, and the possibility of life beyond Earth. He said that deep in the Nevada desert, at a place the government insisted did not exist, he had worked on machines that were not built by human hands. He described flying craft powered by gravity itself, hidden facilities carved into mountains, and a culture of silence enforced by fear. Whether true, false, or something stranger still, his story has endured for decades, whispered late at night, debated endlessly, and returned to again and again by those who feel there is more to our world than we are told. This is his story. Chapter 1. Before the desert knew his name. Before the desert became famous for secrets, before mountains were used to hide things instead of protect them, there was just a man who liked to understand how things worked. Bob Lazar was never someone who chased attention. He didn't talk loudly or try to impress people. He didn't sell big ideas or dream out loud about changing the world. His curiosity was quieter than that. It showed up in small moments, in careful hands, in long hours spent focused on a single problem while everything else faded away. He liked machines, not because they were powerful, but because they made sense. A machine did something for a reason. If it failed, there was a cause. If it worked, there was an explanation. To Bob, that kind of logic felt comforting. The world was complicated, but machines followed rules. If you learned the rules well enough, you could understand what was happening beneath the surface. As a kid, he took things apart. Radios, engines, electronics. Sometimes he broke them. Sometimes he fixed them. What mattered wasn't the result, but the process. He wanted to see what was inside, how pieces connected, why something behaved the way it did. People who knew him growing up often described him as quiet but intense. Not shy, exactly, just focused. When Bob was working on something, he was fully there. Time didn't matter. Noise didn't matter. It was like the rest of the world stepped back while he concentrated. He didn't talk much about feelings. He didn't need to. He understood things through systems and behavior, through observation and testing. If something didn't work, he didn't get angry. He tried again from a different angle. That mindset followed him into adulthood. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Bob had moved into spaces where secrecy was normal. Labs, contractors, places where people didn't ask questions outside their job description, where security badges were just part of daily life. To some people, those environments felt uncomfortable, cold, restrictive. To Bob, they felt orderly. He didn't see secrecy as suspicious. He saw it as practical. Important work needed protection. Sensitive ideas needed boundaries. That made sense to him. Still, there was another side of Bob that never fully disappeared. Every now and then, his curiosity turned playful. Not reckless, but bold in a quiet way. This side of him showed up in a project that would later become famous for reasons he never expected. Bob built a jet-powered car. It wasn't useful. It wasn't efficient. It didn't solve any real-world problem. It was loud, dramatic, and completely unnecessary. And that was part of the point. He wanted to see if he could do it. When the engine fired up, the sound echoed through the streets long before the car came into view. People stopped and stared. Some laughed. Some shook their heads. Others just stood there, Confused but impressed, a local newspaper ran a photo of Bob standing next to the car. He looked slightly uncomfortable in the picture, half smiling, hands relaxed at his sides. He didn't see the project as a stunt. To him, it was just another experiment. On the same day that photo appeared, something else happened. Bob went to a lecture nearby. He arrived early, like he usually did. Outside the lecture hall, he noticed an older man sitting alone, reading the newspaper. The man was Edward Teller. Bob recognized the name instantly. Teller was a major figure in physics, someone whose work had shaped history in complicated ways. Seeing him there, reading a paper that featured Bob's own photo, felt strange. Bob introduced himself. They talked briefly about the car, about science, about the lecture. It was a polite, ordinary conversation. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that felt important at the time. When it ended, Bob didn't think about it again. Years passed. Bob left New Mexico and moved to Las Vegas. The city was loud, bright, and constantly moving. Very different from the quiet discipline of labs and research facilities. But the desert was still there, just beyond the lights. And beneath the desert, something else existed. Large parts of Nevada were controlled by the government. Test sites, restricted airspace, places you weren't meant to go and weren't meant to ask about. Roads ended at guarded gates. Planes flew in and out at odd hours. Most people ignored it. Bob didn't. For a while, he stepped away from scientific work. He tried other things, different businesses, different projects. On the surface, his life looked normal enough, but something was missing. He missed the challenge, the focus, the feeling of working on problems that mattered, even if no one ever talked about them. He missed standing close to the edge of what was known. Eventually, he started sending out resumes. He sent them to companies tied to the Nevada test site, contractors with vague descriptions and long histories of government work. He didn't expect many replies. Silence was common in that world. One resume, almost as an afterthought, went to Edward Teller. Bob mentioned their brief meeting years earlier. He didn't ask directly for a job. He asked for advice, direction. Weeks went by. Then the phone rang. The call wasn't from Teller himself. It came from a contractor connected to the test site. The job description was vague. Advanced propulsion, remote location, heavy security. Nothing about it sounded unusual to Bob. This was how classified work was described. You didn't get details until you needed them. He agreed to interview. The interviews were strange in a subtle way. There were technical questions, but fewer than Bob expected. Instead, the focus shifted toward him as a person. How did he handle stress? What did he do when frustrated? Did he lose his temper? Did he walk away from problems or push through them? At the time, Bob didn't find this alarming. High security work required emotional control. They wanted to know who they were dealing with. After the interviews, he waited. When the response came, it surprised him. They told him he was overqualified for the position he applied for, but there was another role available, one at a more remote site, one that required daily flights out of Las Vegas. The schedule would be unusual, the security even tighter. Bob didn't hesitate. Looking back, people would question this. Why accept so quickly? Why not ask more questions? But Bob understood the system. Asking too much too early meant you weren't trusted. Information was earned by showing up and doing the work. He accepted. The first day came fast. Before sunrise, Bob drove to McCarran Airport. It was quiet at that hour, stripped of its usual chaos. He followed instructions carefully and arrived at a plain-looking plane parked among ordinary aircraft. It had no markings. The passengers boarded without speaking. Some nodded politely. Others avoided eye contact. No one asked where they were going. The plane lifted off smoothly, leaving the city lights behind. Below them, the desert stretched out, empty, quiet, endless. Mountains cast long shadows. Dry lake beds reflected the early light. The flight didn't last long. When they landed, there was no real terminal. Just a runway and a few low buildings surrounded by open land. The air felt isolated, cut off from the rest of the world. Bob didn't know it yet, but this was Groom Lake. His first day was spent on paperwork. Page after page of forms, agreements, warnings, language that spelled out consequences in clear, unforgiving terms. Prison time, heavy fines, lives permanently changed. Bob read everything carefully. He signed. He wasn't scared. He was curious. When the paperwork ended, he expected to be taken to his workspace. Instead, he was told to wait. A bus arrived. It was large and dark, with windows completely blacked out. Once inside, Bob couldn't see where they were going. As the bus moved, there was no way to tell direction or distance. Time stretched. The engine hummed. No one spoke. When the bus stopped, the doors opened onto silence. The desert air was cool and still. Ahead was a low mountain. Nothing special, just rock and earth. Then Bob noticed something off. Lines that didn't belong, shapes too clean to be natural. The mountain opened. What looked like solid stone slid apart smoothly, revealing a hidden entrance so well disguised it felt unreal. There was no dust, no rubble, just space where there hadn't been space before. Bob felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear, recognition. He followed the others inside as the door closed seamlessly behind them. Above, the desert remained quiet, and Bob Lazar stepped into a place that officially did not exist. Chapter 2. The place that did not exist. The first thing Bob noticed after the doors closed behind them was how quiet everything felt. Not silent. There were sounds, air moving through vents, distant machines humming, but nothing felt random. Every noise belonged exactly where it was. There were no echoes, no loose sounds bouncing around. It felt controlled, like the space itself had been designed to avoid chaos. They walked down a hallway, carved directly into the mountain. The walls were smooth and clean, not rough stone, but not quite like a normal building either. The lighting was soft and indirect, no bright bulbs, no harsh shadows. Everything felt intentional. Guards stood along the corridor. They weren't aggressive or tense. They didn't stare, but Bob could feel them watching anyway. He became aware of how he walked, where his hands were, how fast he moved. No one told him to act differently. The place did that on its own. Bob understood something immediately. This wasn't just a lab. It was a place built to disappear. They were taken into a small briefing room. It was plain and simple. No windows, no decorations. Just a table, chairs, and blank walls. Bob sat down and waited. A man entered and began speaking without introducing himself fully. He talked like someone who had given the same speech many times before. The rules were explained clearly. Everyone would only know what they needed to know. No more, no less. Projects were separated on purpose. You didn't ask about other people's work. You didn't share details. Conversations were monitored. Breaking the rules had consequences. The man didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten anyone. He didn't need to. The seriousness of the place did the work for him. After the briefing, Bob was led through more hallways. He passed doors marked only with numbers. Each door led to something he would never see, something he would never be told about. That, he realized, was the point. Eventually, they stopped at a large door set apart from the others. It opened smoothly and quietly. Bob stepped into a hangar. At first, the space looked empty, big, open, clean. The ceiling curved high above him. The floor reflected light without shining. Then he saw it. In the center of the room, under focused lights, sat a craft. Bob had never seen anything like it. It was disc-shaped, but that word didn't fully describe it. It was smooth, perfectly smooth. No seams, no bolts, no visible joints. Nothing that showed how it had been built or put together. It didn't look assembled, it looked whole. For a moment, Bob's brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was a prototype, some advanced aircraft. Experimental, sure, but human. Then he noticed the American flag on the side. It looked out of place. Without thinking, Bob reached out and touched the surface. The reaction was immediate. A guard stepped forward and told him sharply to keep his hands to himself. Bob apologized and moved on, but the moment stayed with him. The surface had been cold, solid, and strange. From then on, things were explained carefully and slowly. No one told Bob where the craft came from. There was no story, no history, just instructions. His job would focus on one thing only: the propulsion system, nothing else. Bob's work area was separate from the hangar. A smaller lab space. He wouldn't be working directly inside the craft. That distance was intentional. There, he met his lab partner, a man who had already been working with the system and seemed almost relieved to have someone new to talk to. He spoke quickly, sharing details with someone who had been holding them in for too long. That's when Bob saw the reactor. It sat on a metal stand, small, about the size of a basketball. There were no wires connected to it, no switches, no buttons. It didn't look powerful until it was turned on. When the reactor was active, Bob felt it immediately. The air around it felt different, heavy somehow. When he slowly moved his hands toward it, they stopped. Not because of heat, not because of vibration, because something pushed back. The closer he moved his hands, the stronger the resistance became, like trying to push two magnets together. Bob froze. This wasn't a trick. This wasn't an illusion. This was gravity. A real gravitational field being created by a machine small enough to sit on a table. Everything Bob knew told him this shouldn't be possible. Gravity wasn't something you turned on. It came from mass, from planets, from stars. And yet, here it was, controlled. His lab partner watched his reaction closely. That was the moment Bob later said everything changed. The moment he stopped wondering if this was real. Whatever this technology was, it wasn't just advanced, it was different. Bob remembered the briefings he had read earlier. At the time, they felt strange, almost unreal. They talked about reverse engineering technology that didn't come from Earth. about propulsion based on gravity instead of engines. Bob had wondered if the documents were fake, a test, something meant to confuse or identify leaks. Standing in front of the reactor, that doubt disappeared. The craft didn't fly like a plane. It didn't push air or burn fuel. Instead, it bent space itself. It created a gravity field in front of it and fell into it. Space moved. The craft followed. No inertia, no stress. Bob felt excitement rush through him, then fear, then something deeper, humility. Days turned into weeks. Bob settled into a routine. Early flights, the bus ride with blacked out windows, carefully monitored work sessions, then back to Las Vegas, where normal life felt less and less real. Security never relaxed. Guards were always nearby. Conversations were short. Even silence felt watched. Sometimes Bob was allowed back into the hangar. He studied the craft from different angles. Inside, the space was small. The seats were low. Everything looked like it was designed for beings smaller than humans. There were no wires, no screens, no controls he could recognize. The craft didn't feel like a machine. It felt more like a living system. Once, Bob was shown a test flight. From a distance, the craft lifted off the ground without effort. No sound, no blast of air. It hovered perfectly still, then moved suddenly at an angle that didn't make sense. And then it was gone. Bob felt a faint vibration in his chest, like standing near a powerful engine far away. Any remaining doubt disappeared. But something else began to grow. The mood at the facility felt uneasy. Bob heard fragments of stories, accidents, someone who had worked on the reactor before him, someone who didn't anymore. The power they were dealing with was enormous, and the people studying it didn't fully understand it. That scared Bob more than the technology itself. At night, he lay awake thinking about the craft, the reactor, the tests, the silence. He began to notice helicopters near his home, cars parked where they didn't belong, phone calls that didn't feel private. The line between work and life faded, and slowly a thought formed in his mind. If this was real, if it was being hidden, what did staying quiet make him part of? Above the desert, the stars stayed the same, but Bob Lazar had started asking questions that wouldn't let him rest. Chapter 3. The nights the sky moved. The feeling didn't hit Bob all at once. It built slowly. Each day at the facility added something small but heavy. Another detail he wasn't allowed to ask about. Another quiet rule that didn't need to be spoken. Another moment where silence felt less like policy and more like pressure. At first, the excitement carried him. Being close to something so advanced, so clearly beyond normal human technology, was thrilling. The reactor alone challenged everything Bob believed about physics. To see it, to feel it pushing back against his hands, was something he never imagined possible. That excitement helped him ignore the rest. But over time, the weight of what he knew began to settle in. Bob noticed changes in the people around him. A technician who grew tense whenever alarms sounded, even during routine tests. A supervisor who ended conversations quickly when questions drifted too close to meaning. His lab partner, once talkative, became careful with words. There were rumors too. Not full stories, just fragments. Someone who worked on the reactor before Bob. Someone who made a mistake. Someone who didn't come back. No one explained what happened. No one needed to. The message was clear. This technology was dangerous, and they didn't fully understand it. That realization disturbed Bob more than the secrecy itself. Inside the facility, everything was controlled. Rules were strict, security was tight, but control only mattered if understanding matched power, and Bob wasn't sure it did. Outside the facility, the pressure followed him. At first, it was easy to explain away. A helicopter overhead. Just routine. A car parked down the street. Probably nothing. Then it happened again. And again. Bob began to feel like work didn't end when he left S-4. His phone calls felt different. Sometimes there was a faint click before a call connected. Sometimes there was a delay, like someone else was listening first. He didn't panic, but he noticed. On his days off, Bob started driving out into the desert, away from the city lights, away from other people. The open land helped him think. The sky felt larger out there. The stars felt honest. It was during these drives that an idea began to form. If the craft was being tested, there would be patterns, schedules. Bob had noticed certain rhythms during his time at S4, certain nights when activity increased, certain days when things felt more active than usual. Wednesdays stood out, midweek, fewer people around, less chance of being noticed. The thought made him uncomfortable. He knew what the rules were. He knew the risks. He knew how serious the consequences could be. But another thought pushed against that fear. If this was real, if this technology existed, then there should be a way to see it. Bob didn't rush into anything. He thought carefully about who he could trust. He spoke quietly to a few close friends, people who knew him well enough to tell when he wasn't exaggerating. He didn't promise proof. He didn't tell a dramatic story. He simply said he believed he could show them something. Something strange. Something real. One Wednesday night, they drove out into the desert. They followed back roads until pavement disappeared. They parked far from any buildings or lights. The air was cool. The ground was still warm from the day. Above them, the sky was full of stars. They waited. Time moved slowly. Minutes felt longer out there. No engines, no wind, just quiet. Then the sky changed. At first, it was just a point of light rising over the mountains. It didn't blink. It didn't move like a plane. It simply appeared and held its position. They watched it hover. Then it moved, not smoothly forward like an aircraft, not in a curve. It moved suddenly, sharply, sideways, then up, then down. Each movement was clean and instant, without slowing or turning. There was no sound, no engine noise, no rush of air, just motion. One of Bob's friends whispered, even though there was no one else around. Another lifted a camera and tried to record it. The footage wasn't great, just a small light against darkness. But what they were seeing didn't feel small at all. Bob felt a strange mix of relief and fear. Relief because he wasn't alone anymore. Fear because he knew he had crossed a line. They left soon after. Quietly. Quickly. For a while, nothing happened. Days passed. Then another Wednesday came. They went back. Once again, the light appeared. Once again, it moved in ways that didn't make sense. Once again, there was no sound. This time, they didn't get to leave unnoticed. As they packed up and prepared to go, vehicles appeared from the darkness. They moved fast and with purpose. Armed personnel stepped out and took control of the situation immediately. No shouting, no confusion, just authority. They were detained, names were taken, cameras were confiscated, questions were asked. Bob said very little. There was nothing to explain. Later, he was questioned separately. The people speaking to him knew more than he expected. They referenced phone calls he thought were private, movements he didn't realize were tracked. The message was clear. Do not return. Do not test this again. Do not speak. Bob's access to S-4 ended without ceremony. The flight stopped. The calls stopped. The facility closed itself to him as smoothly as the mountain doors had. But the pressure didn't disappear. If anything, it grew stronger. Bob felt trapped between two impossible choices: stay silent and live with what he knew, or speak and face consequences he couldn't fully predict. He believed something important was being hidden, something that changed how humanity understood its place in the universe. Keeping quiet began to feel like participating in the lie. The decision didn't come suddenly. It formed slowly, quietly, and once it took shape, Bob knew there was no turning back. The desert didn't react. The stars didn't move. But the story had begun to slip beyond the mountain, and Bob Lazar was no longer the only one carrying it. Chapter 4: The Voice That Broke the Quiet. Once Bob decided he couldn't stay silent anymore, he expected everything to change right away. He thought there would be consequences, obvious ones, cars outside his house, people knocking on his door, some clear sign that he had gone too far. Instead, nothing happened. At least, not at first. Life continued in a strange, uneasy normal. Bob woke up each day, ate his meals, ran errands, and drove familiar roads. But everything felt different underneath. It was like waiting for thunder after seeing lightning. He knew something was coming. He just didn't know when. The flights to the facility had stopped. No one explained why. No one officially fired him. Calls went unanswered. The silence itself felt deliberate. For the first time since starting work at S4, Bob had time to think. And the more time he had, the heavier everything felt. While he was working at the facility, the structure had helped contain his thoughts. There were schedules, rules, clear limits on what he was allowed to focus on. Outside that system, the ideas expanded. He thought constantly about the reactor, about the craft, about how easily gravity had been bent by a machine no bigger than a basketball. What bothered him most wasn't just that the technology existed. It was that it was being hidden. Bob understood classified work. He understood secrecy. But this felt different. This wasn't just about military advantage. This was about reality itself, about whether humanity was alone, about whether the laws everyone believed were complete were actually missing something fundamental. The longer he sat with that thought, the harder silence became. He knew he couldn't just walk into a news station and tell his story. No one would believe him. Extraordinary claims without evidence were easy to dismiss. And he had very little he could share without putting himself or others in serious danger. What he needed was someone who knew how to listen, someone experienced, someone used to dealing with strange claims, someone who wouldn't laugh him off the phone. Bob thought of a local, investigative journalist, someone known for taking unusual stories seriously without turning them into spectacle. Reaching out felt risky, but also necessary. The first contact was careful. Bob didn't give his name. He spoke in general terms. He tested the response on the other end of the line. He expected skepticism. Instead, he heard curiosity. They agreed to meet. When they talked, Bob didn't rush. He explained his background, the flights, the bus with the blacked-out windows, the facility hidden in the mountain, the craft, the reactor, the gravity field pushing against his hands. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't speculate beyond what he experienced. He answered questions calmly, repeating details only when asked. By the end of the conversation, it was clear this wasn't just a strange story. It was something that deserved attention. They decided to do an interview. At first, Bob's identity would be hidden. His face would be in shadow. His voice altered. The focus would be on the information, not on him. That felt safer, more controlled. The night of the interview, Bob sat under bright studio lights that felt harsher than anything at S-4. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had stood near technology that could bend space, yet this moment, simply speaking, made him more nervous than anything before. When the interview began, Bob stayed calm. He described everything again. The flights out of Las Vegas, the hidden facility, the disc-shaped craft, the gravity-based propulsion system. He spoke slowly and clearly, choosing accuracy over drama. When the interview aired, the reaction was immediate. Phones rang, people talked, questions spread quickly. Suddenly, more people were asking about places they'd never heard of before. Groom Lake, S-4, Area 51. Bob watched it unfold from the sidelines. He expected ridicule. He expected disbelief. What surprised him was how deeply the story seemed to affect people. Many had already suspected that something was being hidden. Bob's account gave shape to that suspicion. Not everyone believed him. Almost right away, attention shifted from the story to Bob himself. His education was questioned, his work history examined. Records were missing. Institutions denied knowing him. To critics, that was proof enough. To Bob, it felt familiar. He had warned the journalist this might happen. That erasing a paper trail was easier than arguing facts. That making someone look unreliable was often more effective than disproving them. Still, the scrutiny wore him down. Every detail of his life was picked apart. Small mistakes became major talking points. Silence was seen as strategy. Speaking was seen as suspicious. Through it all, Bob didn't change his story. The details stayed the same. The tone stayed the same. Over years of interviews, nothing drifted. He didn't add new claims. He didn't walk back old ones. Time passed. Bob eventually revealed his identity, knowing anonymity couldn't last forever. With that came more pressure, more attention, more assumptions. Even unrelated problems in his life were folded into the larger story, used to support whatever narrative people already believed. Eventually, the noise softened. The story didn't disappear, but it settled. It became something people returned to when new reports surfaced, when governments spoke carefully about unidentified objects, when footage leaked or language changed. Bob stepped back as much as he could, returning to a quieter life. But the knowledge stayed with him. He had spoken into the silence. And the silence had answered, not with clarity, but with endurance. The story refused to go away. It lived on as an open question. Some nights, Bob still looked up at the sky, not searching for answers, just remembering what he had seen. Somewhere beneath the Nevada desert, the mountains stayed closed. its doors hidden, its secrets intact. And Bob Lazar carried the knowledge that once spoken, some truths never fully return to silence. Chapter 5: The Long Shadow of Disclosure. Time didn't make the story disappear. That surprised Bob more than anything else. Most stories like his burn bright for a moment and then fade. They get replaced by new headlines, new scandals, new mysteries. People move on, but this one didn't fade. It didn't explode either. Instead, it settled in place, like something heavy that refused to be ignored. For Bob, life after speaking out became quieter on the surface. The interviews slowed down. Fewer calls came in. Fewer cameras followed him. From the outside, it might have looked like things were finally calming down. Inside, though, nothing felt finished. The loud reactions had been easier to deal with than the silence that came later. When people argued about his story, at least they were engaging with it. When supporters reached out, they offered comfort, even if they didn't fully understand. But the quiet that followed felt different. It felt like the world had heard him, and then set the story down without deciding what it meant. Bob returned to normal work, practical work, projects with clear rules and predictable outcomes, machines that behaved the way machines were supposed to behave. There was comfort in that. After spending time near something that broke the rules of physics, ordinary systems felt grounding. Still, the experience never left him. It followed him into simple moments, driving long roads, standing in line at stores, sitting alone at night with nothing but his thoughts. The reactor, the craft, the silent movement in the sky. None of it faded with time. Instead of excitement, those memories now carried weight. Being publicly tied to such a story changed how people saw him. Everything about Bob became filtered through one question: do you believe him or not? There was no middle ground. He wasn't just a person anymore. He was a symbol. To some, he was a whistleblower who had given up everything to tell the truth. To others, he was a liar who built an elaborate fantasy. Rarely was he allowed to be simply human. That constant judgment wore on him. Over time, Bob learned to speak less, to answer questions carefully, to avoid arguments that had no end. He understood that belief wasn't something he could control. Proof in the way people demanded it was something he didn't have and never could have. Not without putting lives at risk. And yet, the story kept resurfacing. Throughout the 1990s and beyond, discussions about secret aircraft and strange objects in the sky continued. New people came forward with rumors, fragments, and partial accounts. Some sounded familiar, others didn't. Bob stayed quiet. He learned that once a story enters the world, it no longer belongs to the person who told it. It becomes shaped by fear, hope, and imagination. But Bob noticed something else too. Small changes. The language governments used began to shift. Officials stopped laughing things off completely. Instead of denying everything, they spoke carefully, vaguely. They admitted uncertainty. Unidentified flying objects became unidentified aerial phenomena. That mattered. Flights to restricted areas were no longer denied. Certain programs were acknowledged without details. Documents were released, heavily edited, hinting at more than they explained. None of it proved Bob's story, but none of it erased it either. Over time, pieces of his account that once sounded ridiculous began to feel familiar. Biometric scanners that measured bone structure, aircraft without visible propulsion, facilities hidden in plain sight. People reached out to Bob years later to tell him the same thing. What you said back then doesn't sound so crazy anymore. Those messages didn't make him feel proud. They made him feel tired, because the biggest questions remained unanswered. Where did the craft come from? How long had it been studied? What did it mean for humanity? No document answered that. Bob began to think less about the technology and more about the reason it was hidden. Official explanations always came down to the same ideas: national security, public panic, stability, control. Those reasons made sense on paper. But Bob suspected something deeper: fear. Not fear of invasion, not fear of attack, but fear of losing certainty. Fear of discovering that humans weren't at the center of the story. Fear that the universe was far bigger, older, and stranger than anyone was ready to accept. Maybe secrecy wasn't about power. Maybe it was about delay. Delaying a conversation no one felt ready to have. As Bob got older, his need to convince people faded. He no longer felt responsible for changing minds. Instead, he focused on living with the experience itself. He accepted that he didn't know everything, that he never had the full picture, that memory could blur over time, that critics weren't wrong about that. But some things stayed sharp: the pressure against his hands, the silence of the craft as it hovered, the way the mountain opened and closed without leaving a trace. Those weren't ideas. They were physical experiences. They didn't feel like stories. They felt like facts etched into his body. Bob came to understand that disclosure wasn't a single event. It wasn't a press conference or a leaked file. It was a slow process, one that unfolded over decades, one that happened inside people's minds, not headlines. In that sense, the story had already done what it was meant to do. It didn't give answers. It made room for questions. Bob no longer waited for resolution. He no longer expected closure. Some experiences, he realized, change you without explaining themselves. Late at night, when everything was quiet, Bob sometimes thought about the desert again, not as a place of danger, but as a witness. The desert had been there long before any facility. It would remain long after everything built into it was gone. It had watched civilizations rise and fall. It would outlast secrets too. Whatever had lifted silently into the sky was now part of that long memory. And so was Bob Lazar. The shadow of disclosure stretched far beyond the moment he spoke. It reached into the future, into questions not yet asked, and it waited quietly for the world to be ready to listen. Chapter 6: What Remains Unanswered. After everything had been said, after the interviews ended and the arguments faded, a different kind of quiet settled in. Not the quiet of emptiness, the quiet of something unresolved. For Bob Lazar, this became familiar. It followed him through the later years of his life. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't demand attention. It simply stayed, like a question that never stopped existing. By then, the story was no longer really his. It had taken on a life of its own. People discussed it online, in documentaries, in late-night conversations with friends. Some believed it fully. Some rejected it completely. Most hovered somewhere in between, unsure what to think but unable to forget it. Bob watched all of this from a distance. He learned that stepping back was the only way to stay grounded. Every time he spoke publicly, the same cycle repeated. Debate, scrutiny, accusations, no resolution. Eventually, he understood that the story didn't need more words. It needed time. As Bob grew older, his focus shifted. He no longer felt pressure to convince anyone. He no longer felt responsible for proving anything. Belief, he realized, isn't something you can force. People arrive at it on their own, or not at all. What mattered to him was something simpler. He knew what he had experienced. That knowledge didn't depend on public opinion. Bob often thought about fear, not the kind people usually talked about, but a quieter one. The fear of uncertainty. The fear of learning that reality might be bigger and stranger than anyone was prepared for. Maybe that fear explained the secrecy. Not fear of attack, not fear of invasion, but fear of being wrong about the world. Bob wondered if silence had been chosen, not because of bad intentions, but because no one knew how to start the conversation. Because once you admit something like that exists, nothing feels stable anymore. Beliefs shift, assumptions break, history feels incomplete. Not everyone wants that. Bob also thought about memory. He understood the criticism. Memory changes over time. Details blur. Experiences get reshaped by retelling. He accepted that. He didn't pretend otherwise. But some parts of what he experienced never faded. The feeling of pressure against his hands, the way the craft hovered in complete silence, the smooth opening of the mountain as if it had never been solid at all. Those weren't stories he told himself. They were things his body remembered. As years passed, Bob noticed the world slowly changing in small ways. Governments became more careful with their words. They admitted uncertainty more often. They acknowledged that some things in the sky couldn't be explained easily. That didn't prove his story, but it showed something important. Even the people in charge didn't have all the answers. Bob came to believe that truth doesn't always arrive as a clear moment. Sometimes it arrives slowly, through doubt, through questions, through shifts in what people are willing to consider. In that way, disclosure wasn't a single event. It was a long process, one that unfolded inside people's minds, not in official statements. Bob no longer waited for closure. He accepted that some experiences don't resolve neatly. Some things change you without explaining themselves. Some questions stay open because they're meant to. Late at night, when everything was quiet, Bob sometimes thought about the desert again. Not as a place of secrecy, but as something older than all of it. The desert had been there long before fences, before facilities, before classified programs. It had seen civilizations rise and fall. It would still be there long after every secret was forgotten. Whatever had once lifted silently into the sky was now part of that long history. And so was Bob Lazar. He didn't need the world to decide what was true. He had already lived it. The universe, he realized, doesn't owe explanations. It doesn't rush to make sense. It simply exists. Vast, complex, and mostly unknown. What it offers instead are questions. And sometimes, those questions are enough. The night sky stretched endlessly overhead, quiet, indifferent, and full of things still waiting to be understood. This was a quiet archive story, where the story ends, sleep begins.